This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. About a week ago, I taped a show all about women born or perhaps who passed away in May. And for the first time in a long, long time, and I've been doing this show since September of 2006, there was a problem with the recording. It recorded double fast, so I would have been going, "This is Lois Whaley, this is," and that wouldn't work. So I'm recording this show again because there are a lot of fascinating women associated with the month of May. The first on May 1 is Calamity Jane. There's a name for you. That was her nickname, of course. They say her name was actually Martha Jane Canary or maybe Canary. Anyway, she was born in Missouri in 1852, and they're not sure of the exact day. As you know, Kirsten Olson, the author of Remember the Ladies, has assigned some people, some women, to a specific day if they either lived so long ago that no one really is sure just when their birthday or death day was, or so here's Calamity Jane. She wasn't that long ago, but apparently she wasn't that concerned about vital statistics. She was a noted Westerner. She was probably a mule skinner. It says here that there were rumors that she rode for the Pony Express. However, since the Pony Express was a rather brief time during 1860, 1861, and at that time she would have only been 8 or 9 years old, it seems rather unlikely that she rode for the Pony Express. But she had a lot of boyfriends over the years, including Wild Bill Hickok, the Western, another fellow who was made quite a splash in his day. Calamity Jane at one time toured with Buffalo Bill's circus, and they say that she is buried in Deadwood, South Dakota, right next to Wild Bill Hickok. Now here's a name you're probably not familiar with. Her name is Harriet Quimby, born in 1875 in Michigan. But she was one of the pioneer women aviators. She was born in 1875. She would have been in her 20s when the very first airplanes were actually flown, by the Wright brothers in 1903. And it was some years later that she got involved in flying. And she had a special suit made of purple silk with wool inside because, of course, any of the planes in those days were wide open to the elements. And she did some tremendous things, like I believe she was the first woman in the United States and the second woman in the world to earn a pilot's license. And that was about 1910 or so. And in 1912, she decided she wanted to be the first woman to fly the English Channel. And she succeeded at that. She was only the third pilot of either sex to actually fly the English Channel. But her career didn't last very long, actually. In fact, just a few months after she flew the Channel, she died in a plane crash. Harriet Quimby, pioneer pilot. May 2nd is the date for Nannie Helen Burroughs, who was an educator in Washington, D.C. She was born in 1878, and of course that was after the Civil War and after the freeing of the slaves. Her parents had been slaves, but she was determined to get an education and to help others, especially other young women and girls, to get an education. And she managed to start a girls' school in Washington, D.C., which continued on for many years. She died in 1961, and that school, which was still going, was named for her, the Burroughs School, in 1964. May 3 is the birthday of Goldie Mabovich. She was born in Kiev, Russia. Now there's something that's in the news today. Kiev in the Ukraine. She was born there in 1898, but her family moved to the United States when she was just a little girl in 1906. She's known to history as Golda Meir, the first woman prime minister of the state of Israel. And she was the very committed Zionist. She moved from the United States to Israel shortly after it became an independent country in May of 1948, actually. And she became prime minister in 1969 and served for 5 years as the prime minister of Israel. And of course, that was at a time when there had been a series of wars with Arab neighbors who were not at all pleased to see Zionists move into Israel and set up the state, an independent state there, including one of those Arab-Israeli wars during her time in office. Now, May 4th is dedicated by Kirsten Olson to a woman named Amina. And she was born in a country also currently in the news, namely in Nigeria in Africa, West Africa. Not known exactly when, but about 1560, they think. She was actually a Hausa princess, her father having been the king of the Hausa tribe, or chief of the Hausa tribe. And she succeeded him. She, in fact, trained as a warrior and expanded the state of Hausa by taking over various nearby territories, but all still, I believe, in the current state nowadays called Nigeria. She would take a town, build the walls, and they say that sort of like Scheherazade, whose husband was notorious for having killed all his wives one day after the marriage. She did something sort of similar, they say. She would take a husband from the conquered town, and after the first night, he would be beheaded, and she'd move on to fresh places. But she is remembered in the history of the country today of Nigeria. Now here's a lady, I'm looking at her picture. She's a young woman, fashionably dressed for, about, I'd say, 1890, with a wasp waist. She's obviously got a very tight girdle on, like they wore in those days. But her name at birth was Elizabeth Cochran Seaman, and she was born near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and that was in 1867. Later, she became a newspaper woman on the Pittsburgh Dispatch, and she became famous for pulling off a number of stunts in order to get a good story. For instance, she actually did so well that she was offered a job in New York City at Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, and kept writing these sensational articles. For instance, one of them was called 10 Days in a Madhouse, and that was because she simulated insanity and was taken to an insane asylum, and she wanted to see what conditions were really like in an insane asylum, not what you might see if you just visited for an hour or two and everybody was on their best behavior. So her most famous trick of all was to beat Jules Verne. You've probably heard of 80 Days Around the World. That was a famous fiction story written by Jules Verne in the 1890s. She said she could do it in less time than 80 days, go all the way around the world, starting presumably from New York and ending in New York, I guess, as far as I know. Anyway, she did beat the time. Of course, she had good trains to cross the United States on and good trains in Europe and so on. She didn't elect to go around the world in a balloon like Jules Verne's hero, but she went around the world in a little over 72 days and beat James Verne's time. May 6th was the death date at years 81 in Holland in 1952 of the educator Maria Montessori. She was an Italian woman who reformed education. She thought that one reason that some children were having difficulties learning was that they were expected to follow very rote style, take notes, sit quietly all the time and listen to the teacher and just absorb what the teacher said. Well, Maria Montessori tried something different. She believed that children should learn at their own pace. Some will learn faster and some will learn more slowly, but give them a chance to learn at their own pace. And she also thought that rewards and punishments were not good. She didn't grade the children. She just expected them to do their very best on their own, and apparently a lot of children thrived with that. There are still, particularly kindergartens, I think, where Montessori methods are in use. Maria Montessori for May 6th. Now, May 7th was the death date, again, a death date, in 1967 of a woman who was 86 years old. No spring chicken for sure. And what she had done for her life's work was to serve as a film editor, and not just for just any movies or just any director or producer, but by the famous Cecil B. DeMille. She was his editor, they say, from 1918 until he died in 1959. So that's about 40 years that she edited films, especially the ones produced by Cecil B. DeMille. She didn't get an Oscar for it, but perhaps the most difficult picture that she edited for DeMille was The Ten Commandments. They say that many, many cameras had been involved in filming that movie, and that there was like over 100,000 feet of film, and that was, of course, much too long to serve as a good movie. So she was able to reduce it through her editing to 12,000 feet, and that was still considerably longer than the usual movie in those days. But they say that that was perhaps the hardest film editing in movie history. Her name, again, Anne Bauchens, B-A-U-C-H-E-N-S. Well, let's see. Here's a woman known in English history, but before the Norman Conquest. Edberg or Edburga was one of Anglo-Saxon England's most notorious rulers, only slightly more ruthless than most of the men who were Anglo-Saxon rulers, according to Kirsten Olsen. She married a man who was king of Mercia in England and served as his queen and jointly helped him rule the country. And then when he finally died after about 7 or 8 years, she became the sole ruler. She was so mean, apparently, that she was chased off to France, where she met Charlemagne, the great ruler of France, Germany, and Luxembourg, who was crowned in the year 800. But she didn't manage. She thought she might marry either Charlemagne or his son, but that didn't work out. And she is still known in history as this Anglo-Saxon queen, and quite a spirited and vicious, perhaps, ruler. For May 8th. May 9th is a woman in relatively modern times. She was a Confederate spy in the Civil War, the American Civil War. And since she was born in 1844, that means that she must have got busy pretty soon when she was a teenager, 16 or 17, because already in 1861 she pulled one of her fancy tricks and was able to go from Washington, D.C. She was actually living in Front Royal, Virginia, and a dedicated Confederate. She was able to go to the Confederate lines and reveal plans that she had overheard about movement of Union troops. In 1861, this was. And although she was arrested, she was turned loose, but she didn't stop. She, and it says in 1862, she was back home in Front Royal, Virginia, and understood that the Union troops were going to burn the bridges in order to keep the Confederates from crossing over the Potomac River. So she ran between the lines in a hail of bullets, but got there successfully to the Confederate lines. Union sharpshooters didn't manage to get her. And she was able to tell them about the plan to burn the bridges. And so, of course, they changed their plans, the Confederates did, and attacked the Union forces and prevented this from taking place. Interestingly enough, when she went to England during the Civil War, she wound up marrying a Union officer. But she said he was a perfect gentleman, like many of the men she had known in the South. And so she was quite happy to be his spouse. And they were married, but not very long because he died pretty young. So that was Belle Boyd, the Confederate spy. May 10th is the birth date of Ella Grasso. Now here's a name for you. Ella Rosa Giovanna Oliva Tambusi, born in Windsor Locks, Connecticut in 1919. And she became a well-known politician in her home state of Connecticut. She married and had a family, but she was very busy in Democratic politics just as soon as she could be, and it says she won a seat in the State Assembly of Connecticut in 1952 and rose to be the floor leader of the Connecticut House. There were not that many women who were serving in state assemblies at the time. Then she ran for statewide office and won as I believe the person who actually oversees the elections, at least that's the case in the state of Ohio. The Secretary of State is the person who's in charge of statewide elections. She served in that office for 12 years, and then she ran for Congress and was elected in 1970 and compiled a good voting record. So she returned in 1974 and ran to be the governor of Connecticut. She was the first woman to be a governor on her own. That is to say, there had been several women governors before that, but they had succeeded their husbands in that office. And she was the first woman to be elected just as a woman, not as a widow or whatever. She served as Connecticut's governor for 6 years, and she would have served longer, except unfortunately she got cancer and passed away. Well, May 11th, here's a woman quite different again, Martha Graham. Now here's another person associated with Pittsburgh. She was born there in 1893, and she's best known as sort of a modern dance specialist, enthusiast. I can remember in the 1940s when she was still very active. She had her own dance troupe, Martha Graham's dance troupe, and she continued dancing into her 60s, actually. She also was responsible for making sure that there were new dances for the troupe, and she commissioned various composers to write for her. She specialized in dances about women and women's lives, including the Bronte sisters, Joan of Arc, Clytemnestra, Mary Queen of Scots, and Emily Dickinson. Now there's a variety of women for you. When I was a freshman at Stanford University in 1948, I had a roommate who had a recording of Appalachian Spring by Aaron Copland. And that was perhaps the most famous, the music for that is perhaps the most famous music that was commissioned by Martha Graham, still very popular. It uses Appalachian folk tunes. They're worked into the body of the music. Martha Graham, born in 1893. May 12th was the birthday of Florence Nightingale, who happened to be born in Florence, Italy in 1820. So I suppose her parents thought it would be nice if they named her for the city of her birth. They were, however, English. And she decided first that she wasn't going to marry, but also that she wanted to do something of great service but she wasn't sure what. In her early 30s, she decided on nursing. Now, at the time, nursing was unfortunately not at all a professional, really a professional career for women who were well-born and wealthy as she was. Sometimes the women were either prostitutes or uneducated, or they were nuns who were nursing sisters. But Florence Nightingale thought that the profession, it should be a profession, a real profession. And she became a nurse. And relatively early in her career in nursing, she went to the Crimea. Now, there's another name that's of a place that's been in the news recently, of course. The Crimea was part of the Ukraine from Kiev, but several months ago, the Crimea declared independence. The Russian-speaking people in Crimea, who were not Ukrainian, took over the Crimea, and they actually went to Russia. They got accepted as a part of Russia. Now, they had been a part of Imperial Russia for many years, and it was Imperial Russia, of course, in 1854, when Florence Nightingale went to the Crimean War between the English and the British, and served in the hospital there. She insisted on cleanliness, and that was in the days before the germ theory of disease was really popular, well known. But she knew that having a clean hospital and clean bandages and careful attention to the wants of the wounded soldiers was very important, because at the time, 7 out of the 8 men soldiers who were dying in the Crimea were dying not directly in battle, but from wounds that they suffered and did not survive because the conditions were so bad in the hospitals. Well, Florence Nightingale stopped all that, and after the war, she went back to England and started a school of nursing, so that she became a famous English woman and was the first woman to receive the Order of Merit, and that was from Queen Victoria. Now, let's see, May 13th, here's a woman ruler, Maria Theresa of Austria, born in Vienna in 1717. She was the only child of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles VI, and so after his death in 1740, when she was already a young woman of 23 and married and starting her large family, her father died, and she was chosen as his heir to be the Holy Roman Empress, the only one in 650 years of the Habsburg monarchy, the only woman to reign. She kept up with her womanly duties, was the mother of 16 children, most of whom lived to grow up, and married into some of the other reigning families of Europe at the time in the 18th century when she lived. Probably her most famous child was the ill-fortuned Marie Antoinette, the wife of Louis XVI of France, and both Louis and Marie Antoinette ended up on the guillotine in the 1790s after the French Revolution. But back to Maria Theresa, she was good-looking, and she could use her feminine tricks, shall we say, sort of getting men on her side by saying, oh, I'm just a weak woman, perhaps you can give me some good advice. And then she might take it or might not, as the case might be. And as she went along, she became a lot more certain of her own way of doing things. But they say that she had the most moral court in 18th century Europe. She was a pious person, and she was not above, however, reigning very strongly. And in fact, in her final days, she was one of those who partitioned Poland, who divided Poland up between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Empress Maria Theresa of the Habsburg monarchy. Well, May 14th, here's someone very different, a queen, but a sex queen in Hollywood, by name of Rita Hayworth, the beautiful star of the 1940s, whom I remember in movies very well when I was a young girl. And she had flaming red hair, but a very sweet voice. And she was probably a better actress than people gave her credit for being. She had been raised from the time she was a tiny child, only 2, when her dancer parents put her on the stage for the first time. So she grew up in show business for sure, and sort of under their thumb. She went on to marry a number of different husbands, including Orson Welles, who dyed her hair blonde when she was the villainess in The Lady from Shanghai. And her third husband was Ali Khan, who was a very famous and wealthy Pakistani man. But unfortunately, that didn't last. And they say that after a couple of more marriages, she died at a relatively young age of 68 in 1987 with Alzheimer's at her end. Rita Hayworth, sex queen, May 14th. Now on May 15th, there's a woman called Dorothy Hansine Anderson of North Carolina, born in 1901. And you probably haven't heard of her, and I don't think I'd heard of her much either. But she became a doctor and very interested in embryology, you know, how the fetus develops inside the womb. And she was able to, well, because she was a specialist on children, newborn children as well, she developed open heart surgery for newborns who had problems such as a defective heart valve. She was one of the pioneers in that whole field, and she also was the person who first recognized the disease of cystic fibrosis. In her day, cystic fibrosis was usually something that was fatal, not immediately, but hardly any of the children born with cystic fibrosis survived their teenage years. And she did develop, she tried at least to develop a cure, and she certainly was the person who really first diagnosed cystic fibrosis. Dr. Dorothy Anderson. May 16th, birthday in 1929 of the poet Adrienne Rich, who won a 1974 National Book Award for her poetry. And it says that she opposed pornography, which is relentless in its message, which is the message of the master to the slave. This is what you are, this is what I can do to you. And you know, often pornography features women being sexually abused. Well, May 17th, here's an American woman who became the first woman in the House of Parliament in England. How'd that happen? Well, she was born in Virginia in 1879, but she went to England and married well. She married so well, in fact, that she married the heir of John Jacob Astor, who was a wealthy Englishman who had made a fortune in selling and collecting beaver skins for men's hats back in the 1840s. And so his son was quite a well-to-do person, and she married the son. And when he went into politics, she became very interested in politics herself, and that was about 1908 or so. Then in 1920, he inherited the lordship, and he became Lord Astor. And his wife said to herself, well, I can do this. I'm very interested in politics. And she ran for Parliament and was elected in 1920. She served till 1945 in the English Parliament. And she was a very sprightly person and knew her mind and spoke it out, and that made her very popular with some people and very unpopular with others. Nancy Astor, Lady Astor of the English Parliament. May 18th was the death date at age 92 of a woman born many, many years before. She died in 1973, which means that she was born in the 19th century, of course. Her name, Jeannette Rankin, and she was also a woman who served in politics. Very famously, she was elected in 1916 from Montana, which had women's suffrage. Women could vote and run for office in Montana before they were able to do so nationwide. Jeannette Rankin was elected in 1916 to Congress. She was a staunch pacifist. She had been opposing World War I and the possible entry of the United States into the World War I, which began in 1914 in Europe, of course. But in April 1917, she was one of just a couple of people who voted against the United States entering World War I. Well, her constituents weren't too happy with that, and she wasn't returned to office. Well, she decided she'd run again, but that was many years later. Meanwhile, she'd been active in pacifist causes. And in 1940, Jeannette Rankin ran again to be a congresswoman from the state of Montana. She was elected, and she was the only person, male or female or whatever, in Congress, either the House of Representatives or the Senate, to vote against the entry of the United States into World War II after December 7th. Now, of course, that was not because she supported Hitler or the Japanese imperial forces at all, but because she knew that war was a terrible thing, which meant a lot of deaths, as it did. Eventually, almost 60 million, they say, died in World War II, including 20 million in the Soviet Union itself. Well, she lived till 1972, as I mentioned, and she was always a women's rights supporter. And she marched in some of the early parades for the Equal Rights Amendment, which was passed in 1973. That must have been just after she died, shortly after that march, probably, because the Equal Rights Amendment was passed in 1972. May 19th is the birth date in 1930 of playwright Lorraine Hansberry. Her name is in the news again because her only play, which was written when she was quite a young woman in her 20s, called A Raisin in the Sun, is currently playing in revival on Broadway. And yesterday on the radio, I heard an interview of the current people who are playing in Raisin in the Sun, one of whom is the well-known black actor Denzel Washington, who has won several Academy Awards, but who's been an actor for a long time and was a stage actor before he became a movie actor. Raisin in the Sun takes an episode from Lorraine Hansberry's own life. She was a young girl when her father, he was black, of course, just like her, bought a house in a white suburb. White in those days, of course. People were very, whites were very strongly, many whites, I shouldn't say all whites, of course, but many whites were strongly opposed to having any Negro families in the neighborhood at all. And so Lorraine Hansberry's family had a pretty tough time. They moved in, but they got a lot of grief from their neighbors. Anyway, Raisin in the Sun is about that idea. What happens when a black family moves into a white neighborhood, which was what the woman did in Raisin in the Sun. The matriarch of the family who got some money from an insurance policy and decided that's what she wanted to do. Lorraine Hansberry died too young of cancer, but she wrote a very popular play which ran for 530 days and nights in New York City and went on tour and then became a famous movie starring Sidney Poitier. May 20th is the birth date of Antoinette Brown Blackwell, born in 1825. And she was a student at Oberlin. Oberlin, as you're probably aware, was one of the first colleges in the United States to admit black students and women students. That was when it was founded about 1839 or 1840. So Antoinette Brown went to Oberlin, and after she finished the regular course, for which they were not giving women diplomas in those days, she wanted to take the theology course, and she did, but they didn't give her a diploma for that either. However, she persuaded a church in 1850, Congregational Church in New York, to ordain her and call her as their minister, and she served there for several years, becoming the first woman who really served as a minister. There had been someone ordained before, but apparently she didn't actually serve as minister. Antoinette Brown, she married the brother of her college roommate, who was also a well-known women's rights person, Lucy Stone Blackwell. And she retired from the ministry, but she wrote books and things and was the parent of 6 children and worked as a suffragist. So May 21st, let's see, Elizabeth Fry, the mother of 10 children, a Quaker minister who worked with prisoners in the 19th century, and particularly with women. Now, often these women weren't actually they hadn't actually committed crimes. Most of them were in the prison because there was no other place for them to live after their husbands had been condemned to prison. And often it was not for crime per se, but because they couldn't pay their debts, debtor's prison sort of thing. And Fry was one of the people who saw the plight of these women who were living under very bad conditions in a prison, and she set about to make things better for them. May 22nd is the birth date of Mary Stevenson Cassatt. And here's another person associated with Pittsburgh. She's a famous artist. I'm wearing my art shirt that came from the National Museum of Women in the Arts, which has celebrated recently 25 years of service to women in the arts. I'm a charter member. I first started supporting them when they got going over 25 years ago. Mary Cassatt is among the names on this T-shirt. Here it is. It's one of the very largest names, a signature, I suppose, of Mary Cassatt, who was the only woman member, and certainly the only American member, of the famous group known as the French Impressionists. Because Mary Cassatt went to France to study art, and there she met Edgar Degas, who was an impressionist, and got to know some of the other famous impressionists, French impressionists. She's particularly noted for her pictures of women and children. Mary Cassatt, beautiful paintings of women and children. And she actually was in one of the first exhibitions in 1872 of the French Impressionists. She continued to live in France for many years, and I find her of particular interest because she's a very, very distant cousin, since she is related to the Du Bois family that started out on the Hudson River in 1660, 1680, and so she was of that family, and I am too. But, of course, much later and not talented like Mary Cassatt. May 23rd is the birthday of Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller was probably the best-known 19th century woman, academically, you might say, speaking. Now, I don't mean that she taught in college, although she did conduct conversations with women. But Margaret Fuller was a child prodigy. She'd been trained by her father, to learn Greek when she was hardly older than being a toddler and that sort of thing. And later on, she was able, after her father's death, he had served as a congressman from Massachusetts. After her father's death, she was able to support her the younger children in the family and her mother by giving conversations with well-to-do women who were interested in intellectual things, and this was before they were going to colleges in the 1830s and so on. So she earned some money that way, and then she became the first editor of The Dial, which was the transcendental paper associated with Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Transcendentalists. She later got a job in New York City with a well-known editor there, and took a trip to the West. Her description of traveling to the West was one of the earliest of the travel books by a woman of Western experience. And when we say West, we're talking about Michigan, because we're talking about 1843 or thereabouts, when Michigan was still essentially pioneer territory. As you know, it's part of the Northwest Territory, which includes Ohio, famously, the first of the states of the Northwest Territory to become a state. But she went to pioneer Michigan in the 1840s, then returned to New York, where she worked on the Tribune for the editor Horace Greeley, who said, "Go west, young man." But anyway, she went, and then she became essentially a foreign correspondent. She went to Europe, and she was in Europe at a time of revolution in the 1840s and 1848. She was writing dispatches back to the New York Tribune about the revolutions of 1848, primarily from Italy, where she fell in love with an Italian nobleman who was one of the revolutionaries, although his family was conservative people, and he was separated from them. She had a baby, and they had gotten married, and she decided to return in 1850 to the United States with her baby son. Well, he was a toddler, about 18 months, and her husband, named Osoli, and they died within sight of the United States off of Fire Island, Long Island. And there was quite a session, actually, because the ship ran aground and, was breaking up slowly. But there was this terrible storm on, and people couldn't come out and rescue them. And she and her book that she had written on the Revolution of 1848 died at that time. But she is remembered as the author of Woman in the 19th Century, published in 1845. Margaret Fuller. Well, May 24th, here's a woman who was a predecessor of Helen Keller. This woman, Laura Dewey Bridgman, was taught by Samuel Greedley Howe, who taught the blind. She was both blind and deaf, like Helen Keller, so she was one of the first that was able to learn. She had, like Helen Keller, she was not born blind and deaf, but had a serious illness as a very small child, and so that helped her to recover enough to be able to speak, and later under tutelage from Dr. Howe. Then we have Winifred Black for May 25th. She was like Nellie Bly. She took a pen name. She was a newspaper woman in San Francisco called Annie Laurie. They took after songs, it seems like. But she was another one of those who wrote about things that she had done, tricks that she had pulled. One of her tricks was to hide herself under a table and listen to President Benjamin Harrison on his campaign train and getting an interview with him. And that would have been in the 19th century, of course, Benjamin Harrison. Let's see, May 26th, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She's best known for having popularized something that made smallpox not the terrible scourge that it had been. In the 18th century, she discovered that the cowpox, vaccination sort of thing, would keep people from developing smallpox, which was a terrible disease. And so she's remembered for that. May 27th, goodness, here are 3 women, all born on May 27th. I'll start with the most recent, who's not in the book, but I know she's born on May 27th, and that is the famous environmentalist Rachel Carson, who was born in 1907. Unfortunately, she died of cancer just within a year or two of publishing Silent Spring in the early 1960s about the dangers of pesticides. And that's her birth date, May 27th. Also, Amelia Bloomer, who gave her name to a famous dress reform that they tried in the 19th century, but they got so much ridicule they gave it up. but it was like a tunic that reached almost to the knees, and then over pants that reached to the ankles. Amelia Bloomer, born in 1818 on May 27th. And then here is Julia Ward Howe, the wife of Samuel Gridley Howe. And Julia Ward Howe was a famous pacifist, but she is best known as the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which she wrote the poem for in 1862, and then it was put to the music of John Brown's Body and became the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Julia Ward Howe, also born on May 27th. May 28th is the birth date of one of the sisters of the Bronte sisters, the youngest one, Anne Bronte, and she died at age 29 in 1849, but she did write 2 novels. And so, although Emily and Charlotte are better known, Anne Bronte was also an author. Now, let's see here. Oh, well, we can't forget Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc. This is a death date, and her death date was definitely known because she was burned at the stake in 1431. She was still a teenager. She had been a girl who saw visions, heard voices, and believed it was her need to crown the King of France, make sure there was a King of France, and to battle the British back in the 1420s and 30s. And the English captured her, and they burned her as a heretic for dividing Catholicism by taking the side of the French, of which she was a native, against the English. However, she was eventually declared a saint, and that was in 1920, Saint Joan of Arc. Finally, May 31st, Elizabeth Blackwell, the first doctor who was a woman who lived in the United States. She got her training in the United States, but she was actually an English woman, and she lived much of her life in England. But she was the very first woman graduate medical school in the United States. So there we are, 31 days of May, and a lot of women, a lot of different women. And I hope that you found this of some interest, and that you see what a great variety of famous women there are just in the month of May. And this is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.